Get inside the mind of a lighting expert. So, how this talk came about was we really wanted to show the value of the application services that we offer. And we thought the best way to do that was to make a case study that took customers through our process of solving applications so they could have confidence in the solutions that we provide in our final report. The QR code on the right is a link to that case study if you're interested in reading more in-depth information about it. So with this case study, we were actually able to summarize our process of solving applications, and we kind of created a playbook that we thought our customers might also be able to use to help solve applications in their own lab. It was useful because it brought up frequent challenges that come up in machine vision applications, such as when solutions need multiple stations, even though the expectation was really only one station could solve the problem, and kind of how we recommend moving forward with that. So we are going to use the application we did in that case study to contextualize the process that we use to solve applications. So the agenda for today, this webinar is taking our process from start to finish and showing how you can apply it in your own lab and testing environment. So we're going to start with application restrictions and conditions. We're going to go through the general process we use. There's a live walkthrough that will show you an example of doing this process and how we think it through while we're doing the testing. And then it ends with the results, how we summarize it, and how you can use that to find a solution that's most feasible for your situation. So all applications for us start with the application evaluation form. This information is taken from our form. It's the questions, not all of them, but a lot of them that we ask you to fill out when you're sending your sample to us. In this scenario, we filled it in with common but kind of hypothetical answers for our case study. And so what we really want to highlight here is this is information that you should also be considering when solving your application, whether you're sending it to us or doing it yourself. And there are certain points that kind of often get overlooked that are important that I'll just touch on. Some of them are how the part is presented to the camera. A lot of times that just isn't as specific as it could be, whether it's parts are sitting on a conveyor belt. There's no mention of if there's a lip of the conveyor belt that's going to interfere with the image. Is the conveyor belt itself a color or a texture? Is it white? Is it black? Is it dark? Because that's going to affect the light in our image as well. The light working distance, that restriction, we've had a lot of applications where we'll recommend a solution and the customer comes back and says, oh, the light can't be that far away, it has to be closer. And we have to kind of redo our testing with that knowledge. So factoring in and just making sure we're not forgetting any restrictions in that regard. And last, another factor that gets overlooked is fixturing. Often, when we're doing testing on a sample and when you're testing in your own lab, your part is sitting just on a table and there's nothing to interfere with how the light reflects off of the sample. But every once in a while, we get a fixture where when the part is in the fixture on the machine, that is blocking the light at the angle we want it to hit the sample, and it no longer solves the application. So it's something that gets overlooked a lot. Now, we know not to overlook it, but people who don't have the experience to ask about it. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're solving your own applications is, will my fixture cause a problem? So this form is on our CCS America website. Feel free to go to it, use it as a guide on kind of what to think about as you're setting up the application to solve for yourself, and just make sure you're thinking through all of the information that you need to think through. That being said, it is hard to you don't know what you don't know. So it's really easy to think that you have all the information filled out, but then we often forget kind of about critical details. So hand in hand with what I just talked about, that last report, there were some blank fields on the last slide, and it was also a little bit too vague in some scenarios. Specifically on the example we had, the description of the part didn't include the size, color, shape of the pills or the fact that they changed. It just talked about the fact that the blister pack in general changed. So if we had recommended a red light, that would work in one scenario but wouldn't work in another. And if we didn't know the pills changed color, that might cause a problem down the line. So you don't necessarily need to do it for every single sample, but you do need to at least include the vagueness of any part that we're looking at that can change. Please tell us how it changes, the extremes. It will be this big and this small, so we have to factor that into our field of view, something like that. If the blank fields on the last slide, if we're doing the application report and a field is blank, we typically assume that it's not critical or applicable to the application. So if you're using this form as a guide, make sure that you're addressing each point and deciding for yourself if it applies to you. But if you are filling out the report for us and it is not important, it's not applicable, please write not applicable or NA or something instead of just leaving it blank, so we don't have to guess if we need to consider it into our application or not. So next is the 5 steps of an evaluation. And this is kind of just breaking down our thought process of how we go through solving applications, what steps we take to kind of make it the easiest for us to solve. And every application is different, we understand that, so this process works in terms of the basics, but sometimes, it's easier said than done, and we understand that. So take all this with knowing some applications are extremely straightforward and others require more creative solutions. That being said, step 1, we start by reviewing all of the samples. So we do this by analyzing each sample. We determine the defects that are not good, why they're not good, where the defect is occurring, stuff like that. So when we're looking at our samples, it is important for essentially everybody involved in the application to be clear about what is defined as no good, where it occurs on the sample, and then send us enough samples of each defect that we can have full confidence in our solution. So if you're the end user and you're doing the testing, in your own by yourself, it's kind of up to you to determine internally what makes an okay sample, what makes a no good sample. And you can do that by, looking at your process. Would our process right now call this kind of borderline part no good? Would it call it okay? Do I want my vision system to call it no good, or do I want them to call it okay? And then defining that line for yourself and then using that to, create the line in your vision system. If you're somebody like a system integrator or machine builder, kind of more similar to CCS, where you're testing other people's applications, it's important that you are clear with your end user about what success looks like for this project. What do they want to see your program kicking out or keeping in, stuff like that. It is important also to keep the samples organized, and this is a big thing for more samples that are all the same. You get 25 of the same metal piece. Some of them are okay. Some of them are defective. Of the defective ones, there's 4 different kinds of defects, and you got to know which defect is which one. So it's important to do 2 things. One, if you're testing the sample, doing the testing, keep them organized as best you can. But 2, label the samples. So if you do mess up the organization, it's pretty easy to kind of figure out what went wrong and get back on track. For some applications, like the one in our case study, it's a little bit less critical to be so organized because there's 1 of each sample. They're all different, and all of the defects are very blatant, so it's not as easy to mix them up. That being said, doing application engineering, testing applications for nearly 10 years, I've mixed up samples before. Most application engineers have, and we usually always regret it. So the more organized you can stay, the better. So some tips on, staying organized, but maybe more for focusing on preventing the disorganization, is to label the samples okay and no good. I don't, and this is a personal pet peeve, usually like when people write on the part that's going to be presented to the camera in the area of interest, or circle the defect is my biggest pet peeve, like in this picture. So ideally you can indicate the defects where they are without marking on the sample or without marking in the area of interest that we're looking at. My favorite is when people will, write okay or no good or sample 1, 2, 3, 4, and then have a sheet to the side that says sample 1, okay, sample 2, no good, scratch, right corner, sample 3, no good, flash, bottom left, something like that. So I can make sure that I'm not confusing the samples, and if I do, I have a backup plan. Another tip is to test the sample with every defect. So if you have 10 defects that can occur, try and have at least one of those defects, at least one of every defect to test with. The more variations you have of each defect, the more confident you can be in your solution. So if you're sitting there and you say, I have one defect of scratch, but I have four defects of flash, and your solution is finding every flash defect, you're going to be confident that it will find the rest of them. But if you only have one scratch, you're not as confident that it's, going to catch every scratch that comes along. So just when you're pulling pieces to either send to your system integrator or set aside for testing, the more variations you have, the more confidence you can have in your own solution. The next step is to recreate the application setup. So this is essentially where all the information we gathered from the evaluation report becomes important. And this is where we're creating a setup that matches the restrictions your machine will have and then choosing a light based on that. So we refer to the application report, we match the camera, resolution, lens, field of view. We try our best to replicate fixturing unless you're sending it yourself. And sometimes we can perfectly set up the camera resolution or set up your setup. Sometimes we have to make a little bit of changes to our camera to match your resolution. But sometimes we deviate from the setup altogether if we think that the application needs it. And in this case study, we did deviate in two ways. First, we changed the camera to a 5 megapixel based on the math of the best resolution and the size of the text they wanted to read. The 2 megapixel they were planning to use would not have been strong enough in our opinion, so we were recommending a 5 megapixel. And the second modification we made was a monochrome camera was also listed, but trying to find the best wavelength of light to use with the back of the pills with a monochrome camera was really difficult because if it was a color, it helped some blister packs but hurt others, and if it was just white, it made most of the pills too gray to get enough contrast. So we found a color camera to be a better solution. In both of these scenarios, and when this happens, we will always image based on your requirements, your setup, and then we will image based on what we recommend. And kind of essentially we're saying, here's what, if you want to do it your way, here's the best we can do, what we think you should do. We recommend doing it this way for these reasons. Here's all the information, make the best choice that works for you. So our job is to just give you all the information so you can make your most informed decision. But kind of circle back to how you can use this knowledge in your own lab. Essentially, if you're doing testing and you find that you're not getting the right image, see if it's possible to modify the setup so that you can solve the application. Change to a color camera, change your resolution, change your light working distance if possible. See if you can modify the restrictions. Kind of anything you can to make the application solvable. So tips for you to replicate your setup best. First of all, is to just be mindful of the application aspects that you can't replicate. For example, if your sample or where your machine is happens to be by a large window and the lighting is going to change based on the weather, sunny one day, rainy another day, ambient light is going to change, it might be good to factor in shrouding when you're testing your application, but more importantly, installing it on the machine line. Or when you're doing testing, factor in, is the ambient light in my lab having a problem? Because that means it will probably also have a problem in when you actually use it on site. Otherwise, factor in obstacles that you would prevent a light placement or size. You can't really put a metal piece in the middle of your testing environment, but you can know like, okay, I can't get too close to the right because I've got a metal piece there that's going to interfere. So sometimes you can't perfectly replicate it, but you can keep it in mind while you're doing your testing. Other kind of tips and tricks that we've used, throughout the years, you can take a larger sensor size camera and modify it to a smaller one. Just make sure you do the proper offsets so you're still looking at the center of the sensor. If you don't have the exact focal length lens, you can adjust the light working distance or the field of view to get what you need. That's kind of done a lot. Ideally, we try and get as close as we can. If you have something that you can use to block light, so in your lab, if there is ambient light that's a problem, You can use it to block off that ambient light, create kind of a shroud, and then factor in a shroud was necessary when doing this testing, might need to be used on site as well. And then this kind of last tip circles back to the conveyor belt that I mentioned in a few slides, to try and have different types of backgrounds. And here I say to replicate conveyor materials or whatever the sample could be sitting on. But we like to have shelf liner, I think works really well. I've got some dark, we've got some light, we've got kind of different colors that we found. It's nice because it kind of has the texture that a conveyor belt typically has, but the matteness to it as well. We'll also have sheets of white or sheets of black, just kind of matte poster board to use as a background. So having just kind of more unique things to replicate the setup as best as possible usually comes in handy, especially if you're, CCS, a system integrator, machine builder, and you're testing a lot of applications that vary in what they are and what they do. So now on to step 3. We are moving on to essentially starting to test our light, deciding what light we need for our application. We've gotten the information, we've done the setup, we've replicated everything. Now, what light do we need? What's the real question here? So how is it done? Everyone kind of does it their own way. Essentially, what we're trying to decide is, does a light at a low angle give us the best image? Or does a light coming from the top give us a better image? Or are we looking for something more angular coming from the sides? I personally like to start with an HPR2. I like the way the light guiding plate works as a low angle light at a short working distance and a bright field light at a longer working distance, so I don't have to change my light to get a good idea of if I want a dark field image or a bright field image. Everyone can, some people prefer to use a ring light and then use a specific low angle ring light. It's definitely optional, or some people will use a bar light and just move the bar light up and down. But really the goal is just to find out, okay, which direction of light is producing the best image. And then once you know that kind of information, then we move on to finding the right form factor, the right color, and the right size of whatever form factor works best. So a lot of times you can kind of skip this step if you know certain applications tend to typically have bright field or dark field results. For example, if you're reading printed text or codes, a dark field would remove that print, so you wouldn't use it in that scenario. Same if you're doing barcode or OCR reading, unless it's embossed. Oftentimes, if you're looking for presence, absence of things or orientation, you need a bright field to orient, where everything is and make sure you can see the part being present or absent. Dark field applications tend to be reading engraved or embossed text or codes, damage like scratches, or anything that has height changes like seams, seals, etc. And the thing is here is these are not hard and fast. All orientation applications are bright field, all height changes are dark field. Sometimes it really is the opposite of what we expect. So even if you think you know what it is, it never really hurts to just take an HPR2, move it up and down, and confirm which direction is best. So tips for doing this, as I just stated, always test both types of directions. Even if it seems straightforward, it doesn't hurt to confirm. And then another one is to always adjust the light working distance, not even while you're doing the testing for the direction, but when you're testing for form factor as well, and when you're testing for whatever light you're using. It's always important to try a light working distance at every working distance. You can see on the right here, this image has the same part, and it's the same light. The difference is that top image, my light working distance is about 20 millimeters, and the bottom, it's, about 12 inches, going from metric to whatever. But by moving my light further away, I am not getting as flat of an image. The defects are still present, but now they're kind of blending in with the wrinkles that are not defects at that bottom image there. I can technically still read the text, so if that's my only goal, either one would technically work, but the top image is much more repeatable and reliable and will be easier to write a machine vision program for down the line. What we recommend to have in your lab to kind of make this step easier, I like having a lot of blocks to set different light working distances, so then you can kind of set your light down at different working distances and then have two hands to take pictures, type out the name of the picture that you're saving, stuff like that. For backlight applications, we recommend having a clear plastic sheet that you can use to set the sample slightly above or however far above your backlight you want to have. Very rarely are you able to test your sample directly on top of a backlight or install that on the machine. So we don't want to test in that scenario when that's not how we're going to be able to install it when the time comes. The collimation will change as you move your sample further away, and you might not get the same image you got while you were testing. So having just a clear plastic sheet that you can set on those blocks, however far away from your backlight, it just makes it easier and more repeatable, more reliable when you actually are implementing the solution. We also recommend having bogan arms. There's a lot of creative ways to hold lights in place. So when you are putting in different samples, you're not picking up and moving your light every time. So it's more consistent, more accurate results. We use bogan arms a lot. There's lots of different options out there, but having something to hold your lights in place is always very useful. I've had a few times where I've had to put the mouse on the floor and use my foot to click the save image button because I didn't have enough hands to hold lights in place or enough bogan arms. So if you can prevent that, it'll make testing a little bit easier. We also use copy stands for mounting cameras. That comes in handy a lot. Most of our labs have at least one. If we're putting the camera at the angle compared to the light, we also use a copy stand sometimes, a bogan arm other times, it kind of just depends. But usually copy stand comes in handy. And then having tools around like a level angle finder and a ruler to just make sure that you can note your setup once you've decided what it is. So this light needs to be this far away from my sample, this far away from the ground at this angle. You want to make sure that you can have the tools to write that down and write it down accurately. So once we've decided, okay, I did my testing, I did my HPR2, I've decided a bright field image is my best direction. Now it's time to determine the best form factor and the best size. So of my bright field form factor lights, which one will work best for my application? And this is done by just testing all the form factors. In this scenario where we're looking at the embossed text, we were actually looking at more of a low angle solution, was kind of turned out to be best. So I tested with two bar lights, two LDL2s from the side. I tested with an FPQ3, it's a square piece. It's not listed here, but I tested with different LDR2LA, LDR2LA1, the HPR2, and then because I have experience with embossed text, a lot of times coaxial light will work for that. So even though it's a bright field, technically a bright field light, I did try the coaxial light on the embossed code because sometimes that actually does work better than the low angle does. So when we're doing this, we're having all of these different form factors. With each form factor, we are checking the light working distance. And once we kind of pick a form factor that shows promise, like for example, the HPR2 here or the maybe LDL2 a little bit, then we confirm the size of the light. So specifically in our case study, the HPR2 had the best results, but we noticed that as we moved the sample around, the small 150 millimeter size that I was testing with would have a bright spot and would cover up part of the code. It would be unreadable. So then I increased my light size to 200, and I realized as I moved my part around, I had a much higher tolerance of where my sample could be, and it would still read the code accurately. So first we did the form factor, then we got the size, and then we also test out the light working distance. How high does it need to be? Does that factor in? How much tolerance do we have with that as well? And once we've done that for one sample and we say, okay, I think this is the best result for this sample, then we confirm with all of the samples and defects and everything you have, you make sure that that setup works for every scenario, whether it's, seeing all the okay is okay, finding all the defects. The tricky part, which is what we ran into in this case study, is that the same form factor might not solve every defect. So In this scenario, the LFXV was what we used for most of the codes, except for the emboss code, it didn't work, so we needed to have another form factor for that type of code. And that's something that just kind of happens sometimes. It's up to you or your end user to decide how to proceed with that. Do you have two different stations? Do you maybe have two different lights and sequence them if that's possible, if they don't interfere with each other? Do you just say, okay, we're not going to inspect the embossed codes and it's okay, we'll focus on the print and do emboss down the line? And every person's different on how they decide to move forward with that information. So one thing kind of to comment on, what makes a good versus a bad image. A good image, we have even illumination and it's repeatable between all samples. Bad images often have hotspots or glare that interfere, make it so every picture is not consistent and the same. So your program has to do a lot more to figure out what it's looking at and where it's looking, or just doesn't show the intended results. Like here, the LFV3 didn't highlight the code the same way that the HPR2 did in the left. One thing I want to note is I mentioned hotspots and glare, but my image on the left here has glare in it, has hotspots. So it would seem like it's a bad image, except for my area of interest is down by the code. So I don't necessarily mind that there are hotspots on that part of the image because my code and my program's not going to be looking over there. It's only going to be looking at the OCR code at the bottom. So sometimes the image is okay to have glare as long as the area of interest is consistent, and that's what we want, and that's what we need to see. So tips for finding the best form factor, the best size, the best type of light to choose. I know it's going to be a little bit of a cliche, but having a well-stocked lab will really help because you can really test a lot of different kinds of lights to see what the best solution is. If you have an unlimited budget and you can get almost one of every size and every color, more power to you. If you're a little bit where we have to optimize what we're picking, just kind of short stories, short version, I recommend having larger options for lights that are bar lights, dome lights, and flat lights, including flat dome lights and backlights. Those you can typically make smaller if you have to test to see if, okay, can I get away with a 100 millimeter by just covering up the light, even though it's 400 millimeters long. But for ring lights, it's a little bit trickier to kind of trick the size that it is. So for those, I typically recommend having maybe more of a variety of sizes of those, and different kinds of ring lights, having a few low angle that are, 0-degree low angle, a few low angle that have a slight angle, a few HPR2 sizes, and then maybe an LDR2 or one in there. But we understand that not everybody can have the most stocked lab that they want, so we really utilize demo units or lab discount pricing. Even in our lab and ourselves, we don't have every single light, but our headquarters in Japan has a lot more lights, so we'll even borrow demo units from them to help solve our applications here. So if you're in that scenario, you just want to test the light, you don't have the right size, the right color, whatever, please reach out to us, see what we have, how we can help you. And also if you kind of want to like, hey, I've tried to test with this light a lot and I never have it, I kind of want to buy it to have, please ask our sales team about lab unit discount pricing. Usually they're more than happy to help stock a lab with our lights. So those are two options you can use as well. Another kind of trick that I like to do, this is maybe more personal, but I like to start with the most difficult sample first. My view on it is if it works for the hard sample, it should work for the easy one. And I get really frustrated when I don't do that and I solve the easy one and I'm like, great, I did it, everything's easy. And then I put my hard sample underneath and it's like, never mind, completely start over. So for me, if I can solve a hard one, typically that means I can solve the easy one with the same solution. Another kind of tidbit of information, rule of thumb, we've said this before in other webinars, but flat dome lights usually require 2 times the size of the field of view to get an even and uniform image. So that's kind of why we say larger options for flat lights, because they usually have to be pretty large, especially if your field of view gets pretty big as well. So keep that in mind when you're kind of deciding what kind of lights you want for your lab. We also are planning to do a more in-depth topic on this in future webinars, so be on the lookout for our lab recommendations webinar coming up here. It's coming up here soon. So step 5, after we've determined, we know what kind of light we want, we know what size the light's supposed to be, we know how far away from the part works best. Now we need to know what color. Sometimes the color is really important, sometimes it's not important at all. It's always good to make sure, rule out if it matters or not. So how we do this by testing the sample under red light, green light, blue light, and white light. And then we can kind of put them all next to each other and say, okay, how is my color of my light changing my image? Which one is giving me more contrast? Which one is helping me solve my application? Which one is hurting? So we want to also then after that confirm that the color we pick works with every sample variation. So for example, in this pill inspection, the most high contrast images are the blue light gave the red and blue very different colors, but it might be hard to know if a blue pill is present using a blue light versus a red light. There was high contrast between the two pills, and the red was a little bit more gray than the blue light was white, essentially. But when I put a different color light in, they had opposite results. The blue light and the red light were kind of more gray, and the white light was better. So when you have especially blister packs like this where the pills are changing colors a lot and there's not really consistent, it's going to be the same, these 3 colors every single time, it's harder to have a light that works with every single one of those. Other things to try when it comes to wavelength is to try the non-visible lights. IR is convenient because it removes color and print in a lot of scenarios. So if you're trying to make everything look gray in the same color gray, IR light is best. And UV is useful because it, fluoresces, so it shows invisible inks, lubricants, glue, but sometimes it fluoresces things we don't necessarily expect it to fluoresce. So if I'm ever stuck on an application, a lot of times I'll toss in a UV light just to see if it helps. More often than not, it doesn't, but every once in a while you kind of get that breakthrough, and that's the light you ended up needing. So always worth giving it a try and testing out all the colors so you can make the best, most informed decision. When it comes to testing your wavelength, your good versus your bad images, we want to see high contrast, and we want to see a large difference between what we're trying to pull out. That's the point of using a color light with a monochrome camera, is to create contrast in your image. So bad images would have little to no contrast. In the example here, blue and red create the most, white and green kind of turn the pills gray and they blend in with the background, so we wouldn't recommend that. And then tips to kind of make this more useful, more effective in your own lab. Utilize a full color light. So a full color light is different than an RGB light. It's the way the LEDs work. A full color LED has red, green, and blue in the LED. And then every LED that you have on your light has those colors. So when you turn on red, you're turning on red on every LED. Versus an RGB light, it has a pattern. So you'll have one red LED, one green LED, one blue LED, then one red LED, then one green, then one blue. So when you turn on the red wavelength, you're turning on every third LED. So, for doing lab testing, you're kind of going to get, you're going to be okay because you'll test with one light and then after that you'll test the wavelength. So you'll know if the uniformity is okay and you're just trying to see how the color changes it. So it's okay for lab environments, but it is something to consider when you're implementing things on the line. If you're using RGB lights, typically to get the right uniformity, they have to have a little bit of a longer working distance than full color, just by their nature. And then another thing to talk about in this is a white LED versus an RGB white. An RGB white is where you have all 3 channels on at the same time. The emitting light appears to be a whiter color. But the spectrum of those two is actually a little bit different. The white LED will have a continuous spectrum, a peak at blue and a little hump at red. But the RGB white will have one peak at red, one peak at green, and one peak at blue. So it's typically not going to be a huge difference in solving your application, but if you're really trying to um, get a really specific color or something like that, it might cause a little bit of a difference. So if you have the ability to test with a white light and an RGB, that's kind of going to give you the best idea of what will work and what won't. Kind of going along with this, if you don't have the wavelengths of the form factor that you need, what I use in lab a lot is a white light and then a lot of bandpass filters. So I'll take my white light, hold up a red bandpass filter, and that is effectively creating a red light. So that's kind of convenient because you get the white LED spectrum, but you also get to test red, green, and blue without moving your light and your station and setup. So it's a lot easier to analyze your images later. So that's a big lab tip that I like to throw out there. I think it comes in handy a lot, especially if you're trying to save money on what you can purchase. And then another kind of trick that we use, if your imaging software shows the grayscale value, a lot of times you can put your mouse over one pixel and it'll tell you what the grayscale value of that is. When you're testing the different colors, find the brightest point on your sample and make that point about 200 out of 255, as close as you can get. And then do that for every color, because what you don't want is to pick a color because it looked better, but it only looked better because it was brighter because you didn't adjust the intensity when you went from red to blue. So trying to make sure that every image has the same intensity level, and then you can really see how it's changing the contrast of the image. So that being said, that's our 5 tips of how we solve applications. I'm now going to go through the live evaluation walkthrough, and it'll be a little bit of me talking while I'm doing the application, a little bit of me doing a voiceover, here. But it's really just to give you an idea of when we're solving an application, what would we be saying out loud if we were trying to tell somebody how to do it. So
all right, we've got our setup done. We've got our samples. Now it's kind of important to decide which place we want to start. I'll start with the top inspection because based on what they're looking at, they want to find the right number of pills, the right color, so there's not a random blue pill in here if there's not supposed to be. Like this one has got blue and red, but that looks intentional. They want to confirm the lot number and the expiration date, and they want to check the package integrity, which would be having broken pieces in the foil like we're seeing right here. So it looks like we're inspecting both sides, and in the inspection report it did say that both sides will be presented facing up, so we can put a camera there. So we already know we're at 2 inspections from the get-go. So starting with the top inspection, because we're reading text, I can remove the idea that we need a dark field inspection because we want to read text. However, there is one sample that has an embossed, put it here, an embossed date code, and that's not printed. So this one will likely be a challenge for us to get it all done in the same inspection. So we'll give it a try to see if we can get it all done in one, but realistically, this will probably have to be its own for any sample that comes up like this. Just starting off with a typical bright field light. We'll start with our just kind of ring light. I love to start with an HPR2 because I can move the sample up and down. When it's in a low position, it works like a low field or a dark field light, and when it's in a high position, it works as a bright field light. So here I've just added, it's a blue light right now, but it's a white sample, so the color doesn't really matter in this scenario. This is an even image. This is similar to what I would recommend if we were just looking at only matte white surfaces. But because we have different foil packaging, This is probably not going to be what I recommend because this is not a very even image, and I think we can do better to see the lot and date code with the foil. And even here, this is a little bit rounded. You can see the light falling off at the end. It's not a super even image. So knowing that we want bright field, knowing that direct light is going to cause glare and issues, we step forward to the light that we know removes 3D texture, which is a dome light. So I can take my dome light, turn it on, and I hold it over my sample. And the image here still isn't great. It's better in the middle, but we're still getting that drop off at the end. And the way dome lights work is the closer that you get to the sample, the more image flattening it becomes. So you can see here now that I'm super close to the sample, that image is flat, but obviously this is not sustainable as I've got a hole here from my dome light. If you weren't CCS, this would be a big problem because we don't really have a good way of looking through, getting close to the sample, but not having this hole be a problem. You could probably look into getting a custom hole size that's larger, that doesn't interfere, but even so, then you kind of lose that dome light effect, and that just kind of can be, not ideal. If we don't have to have a custom light, we don't really want to have a custom light. So with CCS, we have our flat dome light, which works by looking through the light and having the light act as a dome light, even though we can still see the light shining through. I'm going to put my light on my trusty little blocks and see what image a dome light will get us. See, we're getting a very flat image. This is a great way to read the sample. There's still a little bit of glare here. My light is about 40 millimeters from the sample, but as I bring it down further, it will just even flatten that image out even more. So this is a situation where the closest we can get to the sample, the better our image is going to get. Right now we're at 20 millimeters. So now that we say, okay, this works for probably our hardest sample, the foil wrap packaging, especially the kind of rounded one, let's just confirm that it works with all of the rest of the samples. And then once we do that, we go through and we take our pictures and save them for our report to show. Okay, this one, it works well. This is the one that has the embossed code. We can see the code, but there's definitely not enough contrast here to see it reliably. So we're definitely gonna have to find another solution for the codes that look like this. Here is a defective product. You can see that there is some holes here. There is definitely some defects. So some splash parts there. This is a whole pattern. It looks like there would probably be enough deviation that it would find this bad. Reading the slot number would be very easy. Reading the exposure time would be very easy. So this is also a good image. And it's solving that defect. I don't expect there to be any changes to any of the bright ones. One I do want to check though is the one that had a pinhole. Yep, so you can see the pinhole is showing up. You can see it right here. The one thing is that would concern me is if the pinhole appears in one of these dark triangles. I'm not 100% sure we would be able to detect it. So what I would want to do is find an IR light. So I know that the dome light, the flat dome light, is the light form factor that I want. So I know that I want bright field. I know that I want flat dome light for this inspection, but now I need to check wavelength. So all of this is white, silver, black, red, green, blue. Probably doesn't matter. I'll confirm that in a few minutes, but I do want to check and see if IR will remove any of that text so we can see the pinhole in any location. Not everybody has a IR light in every type of profile, so I'm going to show you how to do it if you don't have that scenario. You can just make sure that you have an IR wavelength. So this is an IR ring light actually. And you can see that it does not remove the text on this sample. So using IR won't necessarily help us in this scenario. I'll probably put a few more to see if it removes it on any of them, and also to confirm it doesn't remove any of the lot codes, because we don't want to make, remove one inspection to do another. So in this scenario, it does actually make it a little bit harder to read the date codes. It does remove it a little bit more than I think a white light would. We'll confirm that. But it doesn't remove a lot of these. So this is one situation where if they are okay with, yeah, so it doesn't remove anything. Okay, so it does remove the text on this package. So pretty much if they want to have one inspection where it looks only at the packaging, another inspection where it looks only at the date codes, then they might want to do one with IR, one without, but otherwise we don't want to remove that text if we're looking at the date codes, so we're back to using the visible spectrum. To test if red, green, or blue is any better than white, I get my full color coaxial, or my full color flat dome light. To make it easier, I'm going to change my light working distance to one I can put my hands underneath and plug in. So this is a red light. Now I have to go through and change my settings again.
So now we're testing, as you can see, red, green, and blue with the LFXV to see how the color of the light will impact the application. So we're testing it on all samples, and then we're going through and further down, we'll test all the samples with the white light. Here we go. And then this will let us compare all of the images together and see if the color worked best. In this scenario, white was the best wavelength that we could use. Part of that was because it wouldn't have any effect if the sample changed down the line. Then we moved on to the embossed code and checking that form factor. So as I mentioned before,
the far light low angle didn't work, but always fun to try the trusty HPR2. Bring up the intensity. So here is bright field, and as I get more down into dark field, we are getting better results. Try and zoom in here to make it a little easier on ourselves. Yeah, I think that this is going to be readable. I can tell that the placement of this is going to matter because of where my light is. So as that gets closer, my tolerance is going to have to be perfect. As that gets too close to the light, we're kind of losing that lot right there. And I want to document that in my report to explain why I'm recommending the size. So in this scenario, what we would recommend is essentially we're kind of at the point of two stations, because in order to inspect the foil, we need to have a ring light centered over it. And the best way to have that and not interfere with the other inspection is to have it be at a separate location. So at this point, it will be up to the customers if they want to just omit this part, this type of samples from their list of requirements and say if we can check 90%, that's okay. Or if they want to set up another station, so then at that point we would be at 3 stations, one for printed date codes and one for low angle date codes. They would also have to make sure that the sample is coming down same orientation every time so it can land roughly in this, tolerance area for a good image. So that will have to be listed in the report and things that they will have to consider. But in terms of solving the expiration, the package integrity, we've solved that. So now we get to flip the samples over and determine if we can check the wavelength or check the pills.
So now we're testing the back inspection, looking at the pills. This is with the monochrome camera, and we're using a white LFX-V, and we're using the filter kit to decide if that is the best wavelength or not. We also tested the light working distance to see if that was optimal as well. So you can see here that it looks like I'm just using a white light, but if you look at the image in the top left, it's actually changing color because I'm using different bandpass filters to create kind of a fake different color light. And some of them it has a pretty strong effect, some of them it doesn't. This is kind of one of the scenarios I've said where red light will be good in one but bad in another, so we can't really recommend a full red light solution. We could recommend, selling a full color light and say if you're testing this, use red. If you're doing this one, use blue, which we've done in the past. But in this scenario, that wasn't what we found to be best. And we decided to go and recommend a color camera as well. Here I'm just kind of confirming the light working distance being really high. I was seeing some interesting effects on the pills. So once again, just playing around with light working distance to make sure that we have the right scenario. And taking a picture with the optimal light working distance for all the front blister pack, testing it for each one to see what the optimal light working distance to recommend is. So now, as I said, the monochrome camera with a white light wasn't ideal, so we switched to a color camera with a white LFX-V. And that's really straightforward when you're imaging since you don't have to try other colored lights. So you just take a picture of each one to show the solution. So that's kind of the end of our walkthrough. And after, we did all that testing, that was about 3 hours condensed into 15 minutes. After that, we made the report. So here's proving out the solution. So if you want the full version of the report, you can see it at the bottom of the case study on our website. Here just kind of summarizes, we always put what the inspection was, what the conditions were, what we're proposing, kind of why we're proposing it, and a little bit more of the results elaborating on that. So the final conclusions for that test was to move from a 2 megapixel to a 5 megapixel, 2 inspections for the front side, 1 for the LFX-V for the printed text and the HPR2 200 for the embossed text, and then that 3rd inspection for the pill side, moving that to a color camera with a white flat dome. So, key takeaways from what this whole point of this webinar is, what we guys want you to kind of put in your pocket for later. The first one is to test all the types of defects that can happen and include variations of each defect. The more variations of each defect you have, the more confidence you can have in your solution, like I said. And, kind of quick one, test as much as you can and as many different lights as you can for each one. The second one is to be mindful of restrictions that can't be replicated in your testing lab from your environment. If you can't, test right next to a window, just make sure you're factoring in that ambient light could be a problem. The next takeaway is to determine which light direction will solve your application, do bright field then dark field, and then narrow down form factor, size, light working distance, color. But get your direction down first, and that will help save some time in just testing every form factor you can think of. And last but not least is to solve the most difficult sample first, and then test that solution on the easier samples. And hopefully that will save you time of finding easy answers just for it to not work on the difficult one down the line. So that is the end of our webinar. We have time for a few questions. The QR code on the right is our form to get a free evaluation. So if you're interested, please scan that and fill out the form for any applications you guys have. Thank you.